Oh, guess what? It's recording. Okay.
All right, wonderful. So we are back to our queer and trans in the workplace, looking at higher education. And our next question is, now that you have established a career in this field, what would you say the climate is like on your campus for LGBTQIA plus students, staff, and faculty? Again, have you personally run into any difficulties because of your identity or know of others who have? And Shawn, do you want to start us out?
Sure. I think we'll have, I think Nick and I might have different experiences in this regard, because my job now for the last 5 years has been working at our medical school. So the majority of folks that I work with are either professional students or graduate students. I don't have as close of a connection with undergraduate students on a regular basis. I would say largely at IU, so we are somewhat similar to the UW system, that we have multiple campuses all around the state. So Indianapolis and Bloomington are the two core campuses, and then we have 8 or 9 campuses all around the state. I would say the Bloomington and Indianapolis campuses are quite accepting, especially at the undergraduate level. I do think that it becomes more difficult for graduate and professional students because of just some of the relationships and people that you are connecting with. Relationships with your faculty change, relationships with who you get involved with. I know even as a master's student myself, I basically took all my classes in one building, with the same small group of faculty. So I think it's a much different experience for them. And what I hear from my medical students is that it is more difficult to feel like they can come out or be as open. But I think at the undergraduate level, it's much more accepted. The Bloomington campus has had an LGBT center for years, decades, and I think is a much more ingrained on that campus. At the Indianapolis campus, we only started a center maybe 3 to 4 years ago, and have had multiple directors in that time. So there was an interim director that came in, that person left, another director came in, and so I think that is perhaps something to kind of take a look at, is as you're thinking about institutions you might want to go to, whether that's for graduate school or to work at, what's the culture like there? Is there one or multiple student groups? Is there full-time staff dedicated or part-time staff dedicated to those initiatives? And how is that housed within the larger institution? So those are things that I would definitely pay attention to as you're considering where you might want to go after Oshkosh, or kind of what your next steps look like. Because I think you're going to find all across the board, as far as what the structure looks like, if they have centers or not. Not to say I wouldn't go to an institution that didn't have a center, but I think it speaks, in 2021, speaks volumes just where institutions are willing to dedicate resources to.
Thank you. Nick? Mike? Turn your mic.
Thank you. I appreciate that reminder. Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel like before I speak about campus climate, I sort of need to take a step back and think about where I'm located. So I'm in North Carolina, which is considered the South. And recently, a few years ago, we had HB2, which was a bathroom bill. And I think that was it was a really difficult time for North Carolina. It was hurtful, it was harmful, like the media was quite terrible in terms of the representation of trans folks, of trans women of color. And so I think in many ways, like that sort of like paints the picture for North Carolina. Um, and in my experience, like Duke University has been sort of the opposite of that. If we're a private institution, we are protected in many ways that our like public institutions nearby are not. There's a nearby university. Actually, all North Carolina universities are unable to have gender inclusive or gender neutral housing because the Board of Governors made it so that they can't. And so, in many ways, we're able to do things and have policies and work towards things that my peer institutions are just unable to do. I think campus climate, that's a question that I get asked often. And it feels tricky to answer because there is no one student experience. I have students who have really positive experiences and find a lot of affirmation, are able to find community support, have like really amazing friend groups, like have professors and faculty members who are supportive and affirming and um, like are like inclusive, and others who like don't find the same level of support in the classroom depending on their major, or are like maybe in fraternities or sororities that are less supportive. We have some that are supportive. I think a lot depends on identity, right? And so I would say that our trans and non-binary students, especially folks of color, are having less positive experiences as they're dealing with the intersections of not only transphobia and cissexism, but also racism. Um, I think about like some of the really cool advancements that we've been able to make at Duke University in the past couple of years. So been working for years to be able to implement pronoun options on class rosters, and that was something that we were able to implement just this past December. And the response has been amazing, and the response has been really poor, right? So there's a lot of folks, a lot of faculty members who are so excited to have that, and they were attentively looking at the day that pronouns were implemented to see if some of their students would update their pronouns to be on their class rosters. And then we have other faculty members who sort of say why do I have this? Like, what do I need this for? Right? Like, I'm teaching an engineering class, like the identities of my students don't matter. And those are real comments that we heard, which like I would absolutely disagree with. We have a Pride Invitational that I've worked really closely with students to be able to plan, and that is a weekend during non-COVID times where we're able to invite admitted students to come to Duke University early for orientation, and we have an entire 2 days of programming where we have a drag show and we have student panels and faculty panels, and our women, gender, and sexuality, feminist studies departments host programs, and students are able to like speak to other students and get a good idea of what is Duke like for LGBTQI plus folks. And so climate is it feels like a really complicated and tricky question. Like I said, some students are having really positive experiences, and others are definitely facing more obstacles and challenges. I like in terms of my own identity. I think I'm sort of in a unique position of like, and I'm curious. I imagine like Liz faces this as well, right? But sort of serving in a role that is specific to serving LGBTQI plus folks, students, staff, faculty, and alumnics. Sort of like puts me in a precarious position at times. Sometimes I'm talking to folks because they want to be more inclusive, and sometimes I'm right like calling up a professor and saying, hey, like you had this negative impact. And so like as somebody who like tends to be more activist, more advocate oriented, I can end up having conversations that can be really hard as I'm advocating for students to be treated more fairly, more inclusively, more in a more affirming way. And so I like personally don't find that like it's because of my like identities. I think more often if I feel like I'm being treated poorly or like in an icy way, it's because of the way that I am showing up for folks and advocating for a better university, right? Or confronting issues or confronting folks that might not necessarily be in a place where they're willing to be confronted.
I think Nick raises a good point that, what I hear oftentimes from, there's this mentality being a state institution where the Indianapolis and Bloomington campuses have a much different feel. But when you end up in a city like Terre Haute or Evansville, that are much smaller, that the climate oftentimes changes. And then I know as an institution, this is probably not unique to us, that when we try and look at data around LGBTQIA or any identity group, it oftentimes is specific to that school or kind of subculture. So there's not like one culture, I would say, at IU, but rather the culture within our engineering schools is going to be much different, and students' responses are going to be much different than in another school, let's say science or social work or education. And so those are definitely important things to think about. When I got my master's, I was about an hour northeast of Indianapolis in Muncie, and it was a town about the size of Oshkosh. The institution was about double in size, probably about 25,000, but the town itself was definitely not nearly as inclusive. It felt a lot different, right, than where I am now, where the senior leaders from the institution were marching in the Pride Parade, 2 summers ago, holding the banner. So I think it really just depends. I would say we have some of our senior leaders who really get it. Like the dean of our medical school is a parent to a trans child, and fully advocates for trans inclusion, and has said, we will have gender neutral bathrooms in every academic building, that I have oversight of, and things like that. But it really, I think that's where representation matters, and having people at the top is so important, because otherwise we can do all the things we want, but like Nick said, you could have someone on every campus who wants to create gender inclusive housing, but if the board of trustees doesn't agree to it, there's some serious red tape.
So Liz, I think 4 has been answered on there with talking about challenges that students face on their campuses. So I'm going to go to 5 here. In what ways have your intersecting identities, sexuality, gender, race, class, religion, influenced your path and your career? Are there times when certain identities are more salient than others?
Nick,
Let me start with Nick on that.
Okay, awesome. This is a question that I tend to think a lot about. I mentioned that I'm working on my dissertation. I'm starting to write my proposal, and I'm interested in how whiteness shows up and is enacted within LGBTQ plus spaces and communities, and that's either within policies or structures or interpersonally, in relationships. Sometimes it's the expectations that folks have of one another and how those are applied, or the comments, or who's included, who's not. So that leads me to sort of say and think that I'm sometimes surprised as the director of an LGBTQ center at how un-gay or unqueer I sometimes feel, because I'm more often than not focused on areas where I experience the most privilege, right? So I'm thinking about, right, like how to show up for our queer and trans students of color, right? Like how to show up for trans and non-binary students. And so like as a white person, as a cis person, as somebody who is, right, like sort of middle class, as somebody who is, right, like has ability privilege, I'm really more often than not thinking about how can I be an ally to students and how can I do my best to create a community that is inclusive of the folks who experience the most marginalization. Um, and so, yeah, again, it's a like a interesting thing to think about that like when I first started this job, I thought I would sort of like feel more like more gay or more queer. That would be sort of like the place from where I was speaking the most often. But I find that I'm speaking more from my privileged identities as a way to sort of role model to others how to show up in meaningful ways or how to advocate right, for racial justice, for trans liberation, right, for the places where I feel like it's really needed on our campus and beyond.
I would say, you know, I've had similar but different experiences. So, um, you know, I'm out to a majority of people at work, but I'm amazed, you know, after being at the institution for 8 years, and you know, I feel like fairly openly talking about my husband and wearing a wedding ring and all those sorts of things. There's still like time after time where I interact with someone and they don't know, and you know, there's always that like question you have to ask yourself, like, how center is my identity? You know, how much does that show up? And so one of the things I think is important is to be out at work, because I think it provides a space for people to see that. You know, I remember as a student how important it was to know a faculty member or a staff member who was out, who I could talk to. And so even though it's not my, I would say my gender or my sexual orientation isn't like part and parcel with a lot of the work that I do, I do try and make sure that that's known when I teach students, when I interact with colleagues. But I think more broadly around some of my identities, you know, one of the things I always try and do is attend to who's sitting at the table and what voices are being heard. Um, you know, it's so common that you look around the table and everyone that's there is white, or everyone that's there belongs to a particular group. Um, you know, I have my PhD, but I would say I still am an outsider in that most of my colleagues, their PhDs are in the hard sciences or they have MDs, right? And so you look around the table, it's like everyone is a physician and there's no other voices being considered, or everyone is male. And so I oftentimes try and call that out and call attention to that. Um, you know, we have a committee we just created on campus. There's no women on the committee. Like, how did you come up with a committee that has 7 white men on it? You know, so to call that out, I think is really important. Um, to make sure that we are thinking about who we have speaking. In our department, we keep track of who do we ask to speak. So what's their gender and race primarily is what we're looking at. You know, are we asking Black men to talk? Are we asking Latinx people to talk? Are we asking you know, women to talk? And really trying to be representational, because it seems like people oftentimes come to our office and say, we need someone to give a session on this topic. And there's the same people who are constantly asked. And so one of the things we try and do, you know, with COVID, for example, is can we find Black doctors to talk to Black patients about COVID and about vaccine hesitancy? You know, yes, we have some really smart white doctors out there, but they're not necessarily the people that need to be spotlighted in that time and in that moment. Um, Making sure we have just, I think, representation at the table and that people are thinking about that. You know, we just had a conversation the other day about some awards that we were giving out, and I said, you know, we should really be thinking about other people who get nominated for this. Like, how can we be intentional about making sure we have people of color that are nominated for this award? And it's so common that the pushback is, well, let's just let the best people win. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy that to give voice to other identity groups, to give agency to these marginalized populations, like decreases the rigor or decreases the then we're going to allow in medical students who aren't as qualified, or we're going to allow in people who don't hit the same threshold. And I find that I'm constantly challenging that notion to say, no, it's that we think about the people who look like us and who have similar backgrounds to us. And so until we break that mold, we're always going to have those same voices at the table. I think the other salient identity that I think about is class. I had a chance to do an intergroup dialogue about a year ago where we spent several weeks talking about class, and I see this coming up a lot. So I would say I'm solidly middle class, but definitely grew up lower income, and I see that transpire all the time. I hadn't heard of the FAFSA, had never considered college until I was, a junior or senior in high school. And, at the time I realized that there's all these things I was learning to navigate. But I would say even working in higher education for a decade now, there's these experiences and the way that my colleagues talk about higher education, or the way that they've experienced education in general, is just so different than what I did. My grandparents on my mom's side went to school until 8th grade. And my mom was told after she graduated high school that that girls don't go to college, that girls don't go on, that, she was to get married and have kids. And so, I think a lot of those things permeate the way that I see higher education, that there's a certain luxury to it that I don't think I have, that a lot of my colleagues who, especially, as physicians and scientists are second, third, fourth generation college students. And I find myself just constantly noticing policies or practices that the institution has that really harm first generation students, which obviously disproportionately affects the LGBTQ population, since many of us are approaching higher education for the first time. And so that's something I also try and just be mindful of, is that it's not just my current status and kind of my current class, but so much of what we enter into higher education is influenced in the way that we see the world.
This is reminding me too of a question when I asked Nick to be on this panel, and Nick said, are there going to be trans and non-binary folk? Are there going to be folk of color who are here? And as you can see, the answer is no. And a lot of that has to do with the alum that I'm in touch with who are trans and non-binary are not succeeding in getting positions in higher education. The alum that I know who are cutie BIPOC students are not going into higher education. And one of the reasons I find this fascinating is that, in a lot of ways, many universities have this reputation of being very liberal, being very accepting of all people, and that this is where, real social justice is happening. But then again, you start looking at who's being hired, and still the two main things that are looked at are masculinity and whiteness. And so, so many, I'm trying to think of the resource center directors across system, there is only one who isn't actually a director, but overseeing the resource center, who is not white. We do have trans and non-binary directors, but this is a real problem in higher education, and what we say we value, and then who we hire to do the work. So,
I think that's so, I mean, that's so important for us to think about, Liz. And, I acknowledge over and over, the opportunities that I had when I was hired into positions, and, the opportunity to move to Hawaii and then move back here. And, and quite frankly, I think probably for both Nick and I to be the directors of offices in our early to mid 30s is very much, I think, reminiscent of that. I'll say I am younger than all of the people that I supervise on my team.
Interesting.
And many of them I inherited, that they were here when I started, but that raises the question, why was I hired instead of someone else promoted?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's so real. And I remember like I sent that email to you, Liz, and then like I also like was thinking like who can I suggest, right? Because I think like that's like often right like like a place where I hope to go, right? Like ask the questions, but also be part of the solution. And as I was thinking about my peers, right, who graduated from Oshkosh, the folks of color and the queer and trans folks of color who went into higher education left because it like is an exclusive place, right? Like it is founded upon whiteness. Like our institutions like enable and perpetuate racism, and it's a tough place to be. And to your point, Shawn, too, like the person who had my position before me was she was a Black woman, and I think about the many conversations that we had about like what I could say and what she could say, and like we often had to strategize, being conscious of our identities and the ways that other people would perceive us. Like we would like there were many times where she came to me and said, I know that I need you to say this even though I want to, but I can't say it because of the way that I will be perceived. And I think about that often in terms of my tenure compared to hers, and just how like racist and misogynist of a place like Duke can be, and how I've been able to be successful doing the very same things and same things that she would often say, and how I was successful and how she was not, by virtue of her identities and how folks would perceive her.
So the last question that we have is what advice, you've given so much already, but further advice you have for LGBTQIA plus students who would like to go into higher ed? And can't remember where we're at. So somebody start.
I don't mind starting. Nick's like, good. I think, both of us shared this, but finding mentors, it's important as you are starting your career, but it's just as important as you're moving up. Those people that you can have honest conversation with. Sometimes that's texting in the middle of the day and say like, I need to debrief this, or I don't know what to do. It's people to have coffee with in non-COVID times. But I think finding mentors, I've found so many people that I can go to and that I stay connected with. It's probably been 2 years since Liz and I have had lunch, but I mean, Liz, how many times have we gotten together since I've graduated? I mean, 15 times. I mean, but there are people like Liz in my life that I know that I can go to, and I think mentors are just incredibly important. No matter where you are in life, there's always someone, and hopefully a group of people that you can look to. Think about the community you want to live in. Nick mentioned the community where he lives, Indianapolis. You're going to find institutions are in every state, in every size city. My experience in Muncie was much different than it was in Indianapolis. I did not realize the culture of Wisconsin and the culture of UW Oshkosh until I left. I didn't realize, the racists and misogynists and all of the isms and phobias that my family had until I left and moved and met other people and traveled. But really think about where you want to find home, where you're going to find community. I think it's incredibly important. And then building relationships and staying connected. Whether that's with people outside of your direct unit and kind of place that you work. We have a LGBT group at the university that we meet once a month, and I meet with career advisors and residence life folk and faculty members and folks all across the institution. I think it does in some ways provide a unique connection point to people that you may not otherwise form relationships with. And then also, organizations, professional organizations, is also another really key thing. But I think for me, it's all about the relationships, thinking about where you want to be, who you want to be connected with.
I love that, Shawn. I feel like the relationships and the people, what I like those deep, meaningful, personal connections that I have. Like that's the reason why I feel like I'm in higher education and why I'm in student affairs. Like it's a really beautiful thing. I would echo everything you said. Something else that I'm thinking a lot about, especially in COVID times, is setting boundaries. I have found that a lot of professionals enter positions and give all of themselves to their institution and to their colleagues and to their students, and that is a beautiful gift. And I think in many ways, like it's one that goes unrecognized, especially by folks with marginalized identities who are doing additional labors and are not being compensated for those labors. So it is the mentoring, it is the right, like educating other folks about issues of social justice. It's right, supporting students with similar identities. And so I would say like advocate for yourself when you're doing that work, for it to be recognized as just as important as what is in your job description, and be comfortable setting boundaries. Right. Often we're not paid to do that work. I am. I love the work, and I know that lots of other folks are, but it can be something that you get burned down on. I see a big cycle of folks who enter, are enthusiastic, are engaged, and they're doing the work, and then become burned out. And it's not to say because of their boundaries. Like I don't want to say that. Like I think it's because institutions are in many ways like set up to right, bring folks in, extract as much as possible, and then like push them out. There's a lot of positives, so don't get me wrong on that. But I do think that like it makes me think about like how to like have boundaries and how to engage in self-care and make sure that you're taking care of yourself as much as you're taking care of other people.
I think there's a huge number of people who leave the field within the first 5 years, and to that point, if you see people, particularly trans and LGBT or LGBT, people of color, to make sure that they're included in those circles. It gets really easy to make your circle small, but as you think about building relationships, just be really intentional about who you're building relationships with. And I think Nick's wholly right. I mean, I was meeting with someone earlier today, and she said, I have to prioritize because there's more work to do than I have time to do. And I think that's so indicative. We don't have the same productivity measures as you might have in a corporate setting, but there's always work to do, and there's always emotion to give, and things that can be done. And so I think setting those boundaries, COVID makes it even more difficult. I feel like almost every night my husband's texting like, are you coming downstairs? Dinner's ready. Are you coming downstairs? Right. But even during non-COVID times, there's always a student in crisis. There's always another thing to be done. And so figuring out that balance, I think, is really important. And we do all need a Liz in our life. Liz, you may not see that in the chat, but someone wrote that in the chat.
Nice. Yeah, boundaries though, boundaries.
So we have a little time here for questions. So what questions do any of the people attending have for our panel here? You can either unmute and ask that or put that in the chat. Let's
And
open it up with questions you have.
Kaylee will read the questions in the chat.
Hi, everyone. It's John Erickson. This was wonderful. Thank you. I only got pulled into 3 different calls while watching you all, so I feel that that's a success. Talking about boundaries. But one thing I would love to know is, we like to provide recommendations back to the university. What are some things that we could have, well, as students, you wish we would have seen having the university do to promote some of the equity and diversity issues we've all talked about at a higher education institution that, alums and other people could make to the chancellor and other people as we look at how we redevelop the infrastructure of the modern university post-COVID, if that even exists anymore. And thanks for all of your time.
Can't hear you, Shawn.
Oh, sorry. I feel like that's tough. When I was in school, it was a time where I feel like I could be out, but there was not a lot of organizational support. So, I feel like it was while I was with Hope that Hope got more equal status with some of the other student organizations. We got additional budget. We got an office. The LGBTQ Center was formed. We formed a peer mentoring group in collaboration with the counseling center. So it was a time of a lot of change, especially there. And, it was crucial to find allies who could help support that. The thing that's frustrating, I think, is that institutions of higher ed move extremely slow. And, something like the proposal to create a new center could take years to create, right? And then at the end of the day, the provost decides to throw you in a closet, quite literally. I can remember walking around with Liz, with the provost at the time, and they literally opened up the closet to a custodial area with no ceiling or walls and say, well, here you go. And we left saying, you're really going to put us in a closet in the basement. And they were. But I think, it took a lot of time. And that was a frustrating thing, I think, particularly as a student, was, I wanted to see change and I wanted to see it then. I remember, being frustrated, thinking we wanted to have a rally to say, we don't want Red Cross and other places on campus if they, won't accept blood from gay men, and only to find out that, there's a federal requirement that we had to have them on campus. So I think there's a lot of challenges, and even the first couple of years working full time, I was so focused on kind of my job and working really within a department that I feel like have as much agency to enact change. And I think I'm in a position now where I interact with lots of different people. People come to me with questions. And I'm able to have a little bit more influence, but that definitely is a challenge given how complex universities are.
Good answer, Shawn. Yeah, I feel like I have so many thoughts to this question. Something, and then in response to what you said, Shawn, universities do move at a glacial pace. On our campus 5 years ago, students said, we want pronouns in the class roster. And that just happened in December. And it took 5 years of constant work, constant reminding. So like I think that that is probably one of the areas where I would hope and like advocate for a difference, is for universities to like consider that a lot of students have 4 years, sometimes 5, maybe a little longer years on campus, and that like 1 year or 2 years is a big difference in like the time and the experience that they are having on campus. And so prioritizing, right, inclusion, prioritizing inclusive practice and policies, and ensuring that it's not just the work of one person or in a department or the work of one committee on a campus, but that everybody has set goals and is held accountable to ensure that they are also engaging in and finding ways to be meaningfully inclusive. Excuse me. Yeah, I want to see everybody, right, engaged, and not just a few people.
Very well said, both of you. Kaylee, are there any other questions in the chat?
No, there are none currently.
All right. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. We should have made it a 3-hour conversation instead of a 1-hour conversation. Kaylee's going to repost the evaluation for the program in the chat. And for those of you who have been watching us, if you could fill that out, that would be fantastic. I cannot thank the two of you enough for joining us today. It is absolutely wonderful to see you. And, you know, basically to hear your words of wisdom. It's one of the things that Rich and I love about these panels is that, you know, we work with students in their formative years, and then to have them come back as professionals has had a real impact on, I think, on both of us, but also on everybody who's been listening to these, can we call it a podcast, maybe, but this particular series. So again, thank you both very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
And next time you're in Oshkosh
Mhm.
and no COVID, got it, right?
That's right.
Excellent.
Oh, I would love that.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, good to see you both.
Nice to see you as well.
Thanks y'all so much.
Thank you.
I'm trying to figure out how to stop recording.
Wait, does dismiss stop it?
I just clicked that and it still has the red thing that I started recording. It won't let me click on that button again. Stop recording. Huh.